And I'm very, very delighted to introduce Hélder Telo. He's currently a research fellow at Praxis Center for Ethics, Politics and Culture, University of Beira Interior. He earned his PhD from Nova University of Lisbon in 2018 after writing a thesis on Plato's critique of unexamined life. An important part of his doctoral research was conducted both at the Albert Ludwig University Freiburg and Boston College. He was, after his PhD, a postdoctoral fellow at the Nova University of Philosophy, Nova University of Lisbon, where he developed a research project on the art of living and the individual relation to truth in Plato and contemporary truth. His works explore topics such as metaphilosophy, the desire for truth, care, and emotions in philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, Freud, Schiller, and Heidegger. His most recent publications include Plato's philosophical mimesis on the pedagogical and protracted value of imperfection and the care of others in Marco Aurelius' Meditations, published in 2021. The title of his talk today is Philosophical Dogmas or Questions, a Defense of Philosophy as an Inclusive Way of Life. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I must start for apologizing because what I'm going to present is still very much a work in progress, and I also haven't prepared any slides because I was till last moment still choosing which passages I would like to mention, and I hope in any case that I will be able to express the main views or main insights I'm trying to present or bring to the table. And this is my attempt to integrate or emphasize something in the framework of philosophy as a way of life, something that I think is a fundamental trait of philosophy, and try to deviate from interpretations that might neglect or lose sight of it. So I look forward to hearing what you think about it. Before presenting this aspect, I would just like to make a few remarks. So I think that at least the way I normally think about it, I tend to divide between a central component of the concept of philosophy as a way of life and additional layers that can be added to it. And this central component is basically this idea of deeply transforming one's life. And this is something that many philosophies do. It's something that philosophies or philosophers may be more or less aware of doing. They may be more or less concerned with doing it, developing special techniques for doing so. But so in some cases they may do so. In other cases it may be more discreet or less emphatic. But it would still be in some way, or it could still be regarded in some way as philosophy, as a way of life. In any case, the ideal form would imply this awareness and special concern with this deep transformation of life. This is the basic core, so to speak, but then we could also further determine it and fold it or formalize it. And several of the aspects that Adot discusses, I tend to interpret in this way, and especially as the result of a special attention to the characteristics that philosophy as a way of life had in the Hellenistic and Roman philosophy, which is often used as the main example, not only by Adot, but also by Foucault, by Marta in many moments. So there's this group of meta-philosophers for whom ancient philosophy or Hellenistic philosophy, especially Stoic and the degree in philosophy, are taken as the ideal form in a certain sense, or the main inspiration, and this tends to add layers of determination that for me, that I tend to regard as additional and also as questionable in some aspects, or at least something we can discuss, that if this is the best formalization or not. And in saying this, I'm already pointing to one other aspect that I would like to mention. So I think this approach can be both, or we can have a descriptive approach on discussing how several philosophers understand philosophy as a way of life, but we can also strive for a normative component and try to see what philosophy as a way of life should be or should ideally be, what philosophy in general should ideally be. This raises the problem of what the criterion or the criteria for that might be. So is it a question of what is philosophy's original form, what is its most proper sense in the sense of how it was invented and how it was originally conceived? Is a question of a particular tradition and what are the main features of that tradition, or what is the most common features, or is it a question of the highest potential or vocation, something that might even still be to come? So it might be the case that there is still no philosophy with that configuration, or there was no philosophy with that configuration. And I think these are very interesting questions, and these are questions I normally engage with. So I think this idea of normativity, or what would be the ideal form of philosophy, or what is the ideal form of philosophy, is a very helpful heuristic tool, especially if we don't regard it as a mere imposition, or not, especially if we don't try to impose simply a model of understanding philosophy, but we see more as a way of pressuring us to think about philosophy's possibilities and to try to examine exactly what each configuration of philosophy is doing and trying to do, and what its limitations are. And also, it's very important here that we just simply don't try to deny the validity of other forms of activity. So it's possible, I say this because it's possible that we come to the conclusion that philosophy is a particular thing, and other things are not doing what philosophy is supposed to do as well as others, but they might be doing something else that we might designate by another name, and it might be that it has its own validity. So it's not necessary that also in saying that something is more philosophical than other, it does not necessarily mean that it is better or has a more right to exist. Simply that perhaps the way we should understand this word applies more to some configuration than to other. And this raises also the question of that we partially discussed yesterday with Pavel of exactly what is the name that we should use to designate different activities, and this philosophy is the right name to designate all the ranges of things that it usually designates. So my goal then is also partially concerned with this question of what is the better form to understand philosophy and philosophy as a way of life. And so the contrast that I'll try to discuss is also moving in this direction, although it is not exclusively moving in this direction. So there's also a question of description of how different forms of philosophy, or how different forms of activity in what we consider what we see as the Western philosophical tradition, how they are constituted and how they develop, or what they are. So going now more specifically to the question I'll be discussing, I want to oppose a way of understanding philosophy, more particular philosophy as a way of life, that can easily be adopted, that we might be tempted to adopt it, that often seems to be adopted, even if tacitly in many discussions. And I think that this way of understanding philosophy as a way of life is also partially promoted by Hadot. So as I'll try to argue later, Hadot has a certain ambiguity in the sense that many of his statements seem to directly oppose this, and then in other moments it seems that he is thinking a lot close or is thinking similar lines to what I'm now going to mention. And I look forward to hear what the specialists in Hadot think about this, and it might be the case that I'm not considering an important aspect. This model that I'm opposing, I think it's something that is easily suggested by the Hellenistic forms of philosophy, and though in the case of Hadot and Foucault, it tends then to influence the whole interpretation of the interpretation of the whole ancient philosophy and even of the whole tradition of philosophy, or particularly of philosophy as a way of life, or philosophy as spirituality, as of Foucault. And this model of understanding philosophy as a way of life is represented in my title with this notion of philosophical dogmas. And it corresponds to what we could call sapiential model of philosophy as a way of life. And the notion of dogmas here is referring to philosophical doctrines, to established views, to arguments. So these views that define how things are, how we should live, and even how we should transform ourselves, something that is also associated with this idea of a worldview and understanding of what the world is and how we situate ourselves in it, or should situate ourselves in it. And it corresponds to the perfection of knowledge that Hadot mentioned as one of the traits of wisdom. So this more cognitive aspect of wisdom is what is here at stake. So this is why I also chose the functional model to designate it. And of course, I do also consider that wisdom has this component of a mode of being, but it has in any case a component of knowledge. And this is what I'm referring to. So this is a model where there is something as knowledge or perfect knowledge, and philosophy is associated with it. And this is then what guides life. And considering the task of our project of mapping philosophy as a way of life, in this framework, this map would be basically a map of different philosophical doctrines, different worldviews presented throughout the history of philosophy, and how they transform life, how effective or not they are, what techniques they involve to do so. As I said, this is a model that we might be easily tempted to follow, that often seems to be followed. It corresponds to something that Hadot says in his Philosophy as a Way of Life essay, or the essay on philosophy as a way of life, where he talks almost at the beginning, page 265 of the English edition. He talks about wisdom as a way of life. He uses his exact expression. Precisely this is the model that I'm opposing, and the different model I'm proposing is what we could call the erotetic, by reference to erotesis, the Greek word for question, or the inquisitive model. So this is the model that is represented, it's titled by this idea of questions or philosophical questions, and the notion of question here is used, as I'll explain later, in a sense that also includes this idea of desire for knowledge, wanting to find the answer, of looking for it. So in the sense of love of wisdom, but this also as desire for wisdom and as a quest for wisdom. These are all expressions that Hadot uses. So not only love of wisdom, desire for wisdom, quest for wisdom, in some aspects, and these other expressions other than love of wisdom, I think are also very helpful to understand what is here at stake. So it is the exact sense of philosophia in Greek, and in this model I'm proposing, it's very important, this idea precisely of the separation between our philosophy as something different from sophia, from wisdom. And in this sense, it could be described as a model of the desire for wisdom as a way of life, opposed to the wisdom as a way of life model. This contrast raises several questions. First, the question of knowing exactly how different it is, how different this erotetic, this questioning interrogative model is, how different it is from the sapiential model. Second question of whether they can be in some way compatibilized, or how incompatible they are. So it's also possible that they are somehow that they can be combined. That we can also then place the emphasis on different aspects. So it might be also a question of emphasis, and I'll try to discuss this. Other questions include what the implications for the normative understanding of philosophy and philosophy as a way of life are, and what are the implications for the reading of the history of philosophy or history of philosophy as a way of life. And I hope I'll have time to go into a bit into this, but I don't know if it will be possible. In any case, I mentioned that these are also questions that are included in this reflection. So my itinerary includes 3 moments. The first moment is to consider exactly what is said about dogmas, doctrines, wisdom, and also questions in Hadot and some of the philosophy as a way of life literature, or literature that is closely connected with it, or also a similar approach, like Foucault, for instance. And second, I would like to outline a brief phenomenology of questions and considering their role, their connection with philosophical discourse and philosophical practice, and also determining the possibility of a way of life determined by questions. And third, if I have the time, I would like to also briefly consider some of the most significant consequences of recognizing the importance of questions in philosophical life for the project of mapping the history of philosophy as a way of life. So the first point, the question of how exactly this component of wisdom, of dogmas and questions is considered in secondary literature. So there are some passages that explicitly refute the sapiential model, in Hadot in particular, but often, as far as I can see, it is not excluded, and sometimes the descriptions even work with something close to it or that follows those lines. And this is partially because in many cases they are discussing Hellenistic philosophy, where it seems to be the case, or that model seems to be more easily suggested. In other cases, more general question. So in the case of Pierre Hadot, something that he often stresses is precisely the fact that philosophy. So before that, there are, if you look for the word question or similar words, there are several references. So it is often referred when referring to the figure of Socrates. He says in page 89 of the essay on spiritual exercises that Socrates harassed his interlocutors with questions which put themselves into question, forcing them to pay attention to and take care of themselves, end quote. And in the essay, The Figure of Socrates, page 49, I'm always quoting the English translation, Hadot writes, and I quote, "The original nucleus of this phenomenon, Socrates as a mask, or mask of Socrates, was the irony of Socrates himself. Socrates, the eternal interrogator, used skillful questions to bring his interlocutors to admit their ignorance. By so doing, he disturbed them so much that they were eventually led to question their entire lives." That is stress here, this idea of disturbing. Will be important later on. And in other cases, the passages where he mentions questions are referring to practices in ancient philosophy where questions were more associated sadly with dogmas or with the discussions of theses. So instead of simply saying what they believe, they will ask questions, a sort of methodological presentation of these dogmas or the views that were being presented. It's what happens in Plato's Sophists and Statesmen. So Hadot also refers to this, and he refers to several passages or authors' practices that use questions. So he refers to the seventh letter in the essay on spiritual exercises, where he says that one spends a long time in the company of these questions. So he's paraphrasing Plato, or quoting Plato, "One lives with them until the light blazes forth." And he then also refers in Aristotle, so that how metaphysics is actually a discussion of questions, and questions play a very important role. It's not simply a presentation of a fully established doctrine. And he also mentions questions in Plotinus or practices that associate with questions, presents as a Christian examination of consciousness, also as a form of questioning. So, strong similarity between notion of questioning and notion of examining. And in other occurrences, he also talks about text. Or in one other occurrence, he talks about texts as something that raises questions. So in the essay Philosophy, Exegesis and Creative Mistakes, page 73 of the Philosophy as a Way of Life book, he says that the fact that authentic texts raise questions is not due to any inherent defect. On the contrary, their obscurity, it was thought, was only the result of a technique used by a master who wished to hint at a great many things at once and therefore enclosed the truth in his formulations. It's important to note that he's also referring here to a truth, so sort of dogma that is, in any case, not presented as such, presented as an interrogation, as a better way of communicating the dogma. So, and this happened in several other passages where questions, discussions are associated with presentation of theses and even the characterization of spiritual exercise of particular spiritual exercises refer to this idea of application, so to speak, of doctrines that are already established. So in page 85 of the essay on spiritual exercises, he says about attention, I quote, "Attention prosoche allows us to respond immediately to events as if they were questions asked of us all of a sudden. In order for this to be possible, we must always have the fundamental principles at hand. We are to steep ourselves in the rule of life, canon, by mentally applying it to all life's possible different situations." So different situations of life are seen as questions, as challenges, something that we must give a response to, but the response is basically applying the dogmas that are already established. But these are the occurrences of questions, but there's a very important set of passages that that are very relevant in this context. These are the passages where he stresses that philosophy, and more specifically ancient philosophy, is characterized by the distance from wisdom, or by being separated from wisdom. So in page 4, the English translation of what is ancient philosophy, Adol writes, "One of the fundamental themes of this book will be the distance which separates philosophy from wisdom. Philosophy is merely a preparatory exercise for wisdom." And he, end quote, he often also says that wisdom or the sage are a transcendent state, a transcendent norm. So that's this idea of transcendence, that's something that is not immediately accessible. On page 4 of What is Ancient Philosophy, he also writes, "Beginning with Plato's Symposium, ancient philosophy admits in one way or another that the philosopher is no sage." Page 46, he writes, "The philosopher will never attain wisdom, but he can make progress in this direction." And in page 47, he writes, "Philosophy's tonality is also tragic because the bizarre being called the philosopher is tortured and torn by the desire to attain this wisdom which escapes him, yet which he loves." End quote. This is the part where he's discussing Plato's Symposium, if I'm not mistaken. So there's this idea of global wisdom, of desire for wisdom, as something that is not present and is probably can never be attained. Although there are also passages where this is limited, and I'll mention that in a second. So I would also like to mention in this regard the definition of sage that involves not only this idea of being a transcendent norm, but is also often connected with the idea, or for Adorno, it's intrinsically connected with the idea of tranquility, of freedom and cosmic consciousness. So there are several discussions of this where wisdom is a state that is intrinsically associated with these components. And this is important because you can already see some contrast with the idea of philosophy being a tragic condition. And as I'll try to say, it's also somewhat in contrast with the idea of the restlessness of the philosopher and the indetermination of reality that is accompanied by this lack of wisdom. But before coming to that, I would like also to mention that there are several passages that seem to go at least partially against this idea that one is separated from wisdom. So, and this might be because Otto is being very brief at the point and is not being very, it's not defining exactly what he's saying, or qualifying exactly what he's saying. For instance, in page 82 and 83 of the essay on spiritual exercises, he says, it, the philosophical act, raises the individual from an inauthentic condition of life, darkened by unconsciousness and harassed by worry, to an authentic state of life in which he attains self-consciousness, an exact vision of the world, inner peace and freedom. So there's at least the suggestion that philosophy accomplishes this. And at some moments, he also seems to admit this idea of exceptional moments. So he writes in the essay, The Sage and the World, in the book Philosophy as a Way of Life, page 265, he writes, the ancients knew that they would never be able to realize wisdom within themselves as a stable, definitive state, but they at least hoped to accede to it in certain privileged moments, and wisdom was the transcendent norm which guided their action. This idea of privileged moments that appears in other passages when he mentions, for instance, that there was at least says quote, the discourse of Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus stops at the threshold of certain experiences which, if they are not wisdom, are at least a kind of foretaste of it. End quote. And in another passage he says that for the Stoics was a kind of transcendent state, wisdom for the Stoics was a kind of transcendent state which could be attained only by a sudden, unexpected mutation. It's page 49 of what is ancient philosophy. And there are passages where he mentions Socrates as a sage, where he says he's concerting sage who did not know he was a sage. So he's referring also to the ancient conception of it. And what? Thank you. There are these passages where it seems to come closer to the direct association of philosophy with wisdom, or admitting the possibility that wisdom can be also a configuration of philosophy. And in order to be brief, I'll just mention that this sapiential model of philosophy as a way of life is also suggested, I think, in several other authors. So in Foucault, when he talks about spirituality as technique associated with what he in other passages called techniques of the self, or the practice of the self, that transform the self in order to give access to the truth. So it seems that this idea of having access to the truth, of attaining wisdom, is also a part of the process and seems to be emphasized here. So it normally doesn't mention questions. So looking for the word question in, for instance, in the hermeneutics of the subject, we only find this use that this is the question of C's. I'm going to discuss the question of why and things like that. So it's not mentioned as a practice of the self or a technique of the self. If you look Marta Nussbaum, she presents a model of rational therapy that uses reasoning and powerful argument in order to cure illnesses, the diseases of the soul, in order to overcome desire, pain. So it seems that knowledge is constituted and allows then philosophy to act as a therapy. And in John Seller's book, The Art of Living, The Stoics on Nature and Function of Philosophy, Sellers identifies in Stoic texts this model that is often then used by other scholars, more general metaphilosophical discussions, that there's this technical model of philosophy, or what we call the technical model of philosophy, that has as a first that in the first moment implies the mastery of philosophical doctrines, principles, logi, and in the second moment, the period of training or practice, where one is then able to incorporate these doctrines and live according to them. And in the 2017 essay, What is Philosophy as a Way of Life, the traits that are presented as the main traits of philosophy as a way of life include this idea of transforming life, and then the ideas of there being a consistency between the ideas and the behavior, and of sort of trait actions being more important than words, especially the second trait of consistency between ideas and behavior. It seems to be that it also makes appeal to this idea that there are somehow doctrines that are applied. And in the case of John Cooper, in his book Pursuits of Wisdom, he also talks about there being a reasoned, articulated philosophical understanding, or an argued true, rational, worked out, rationally grasped and rationally defended, reasoned ideas about the world and one's place within it. This is then what guides life, according to him. This is page 17 of the book. And Michael Chase, in his essay, Observations on Pierre Hadot's Conception of Philosophy as a Way of Life, provides a very interesting case, because he also mentioned at some point the idea of transition from theory to practice, of integrating a set of philosophical beliefs into our day-to-day behavior in order to make them a natural, organic part of our lives, so to say, applying dogmas that are somehow established. But he then spends most of the essay discussing big philosophical questions, talking about the importance for him of big philosophical questions, and that the model of philosophy as a way of life allows us to discuss it. So here is one of the cases where questions are more highlighted. And finally, in Sharp's and Muir's book, in the introduction, there's this wonderful systematization with the 10 features of philosophy as a way of life, where you find a very complete model, and I find it very stimulant. But the whole description does not include questions anymore, so it's absent there. There's some discussion in the chapter on Socrates, but it's not presented as a main model there. So how much time do I have? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay. So now going to what I call the phenomenology of question or questions.
8 minutes.
8 minutes. So normally things present themselves to us in a certain way, as defined in many ways, and we have many views on them, or we have definite views on them, of which we may be more or of less sure. These views often include the view that what we see or what we think about it is all that there is to it, or all that is relevant for it, and that things are actually so and not otherwise. So there's the idea of completude and the idea of being actually so and not otherwise. However, we may also be dissatisfied or unsure, and it's often the case. So things might seem problematic, might become problematic for us. We might start seeing different possibilities, contemplating them, and they might seem a very real possibility. This is something that might have these moments of doubt, of seeing things as problematic. It's something that may happen spontaneously, so we might start thinking about it and try to provoke it, or it might be imposed on us by moments of wonder, astonishment, by someone else's instigation. And this is often circumscribed to particular aspects. So many of the questions we face concern very particular aspects of reality. And in these moments, we tend to relate to something else. So to different possibilities, there's an opening of perspective, an extension, or what Kant calls a negative Erweiterung, a negative expansion. So there's already contact with some transcendence, but it is still absent. It's still not, we still do not have an access to it. It's still withheld in some sense. And so we need to question, we need to inquiry, and it triggers a desire for knowledge. So that's this association of questions, inquiry, and desire for knowledge, which is very important for my point and for the analysis that I'm trying to develop. So the questions might be very different, or they might differ in many different ways, and they might focus on very different aspects of reality, or very different points. They might be directed at others, or they might be something that we make to ourselves. There's a difference between questions. And they also admit of very different existential modalities. So questions might be merely rhetoric, something that we ask without being especially concerned with it. It might be manifestation of curiosity, something that we, in a particular moment, would like to know, but it's not particularly disturbing not to know. And but they also might have a very deep impact on us, and they might affect some important aspects of our lives. And it might happen what Augustine mentions in Book 10 of the Confessions, that one might become a question unto oneself. Vi quaesio pactus sum. This might happen, so our entire being might become questionable, problematic, and in these cases, philosophy has a much deeper impact. Questions have a much deeper impact, and the need to know is also much greater. So all questions in general are a matter of knowledge, but there's also this subset of questions, philosophical questions, and it's difficult to determine exactly what characterizes them. It's often presented as a question of a different type of object as being more abstract or more referring to the fundamentals of our experience or the totality of reality. The philosophical questions also seem to involve more directly our perspective, our values, the constitution of the subject, so to speak. And they also seem to have a very privileged relation with logos. They often are clearly articulated questions, involve conceptual language, and they are associated with an intensified relation to knowledge. So in the sense that they have greater scope, they involve, and as such involve also greater indetermination and the greater need for suppression of indetermination. They are seen as relevant, which is not always the case. So there's also different existential modalities in this case. They might also be rhetorical, something one does, for instance, in academy, as a technical discussion in articles. And they also may be object of intellectual curiosity, or they may have a deep impact on our lives. So there might be questions we are faced as essential for determining our lives. They might seem arbitrary or too abstract for many people, although for philosophers they are often presented not only as very important, but even as somehow the essence of our being or associated with the essence of our being. Plato, for instance, describes the soul as having at its core thought, and thought is presented as a dialogue of the soul with itself. And this dialogue is not a simple dialogue, it's not a simple conversation. Plato presents it as the soul asking questions to itself and giving answers to itself, and this corresponds to doxa. So this discussion we find in Epictetus and also in the Sophists. This idea that there's a questioning of the soul by itself and giving answers by itself. And Kant, in the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason, also speaks about reason as something that poses questions to itself that it cannot escape. So it's almost an essential trait of reason. And in any case, questions is something that may come to dominate our lives. They might have a deep impact on us, and given the extraordinary difficulty of these questions, this easily converts in inquisitive way of life. So if one cannot escape these questions, one is doomed to face them and try to find an answer. One is doomed to pursue knowledge, and so and convert in a philosophical way of life in the sense of an inquisitive, interrogative way of life, which is presented, of course, which is, of course, a provisional state in the sense that it aims at something else, but it might be a very long or a state where one dwells for a very long time, or even a permanent state. And a very important trait of this is the fact that it involves, it is experienced as this very intense and deep form of questioning. It involves a very deep definition of the most important aspects of life, and it has a very disturbing character. So it is experienced as aporia, as something that, as a lack of orientation, is experienced as mystery, as reality or self becomes somehow inhospitable, disturbing. So it seems to me to be quite different from at least some of the aspects that are associated with cosmic consciousness, this feeling of full integration. It might be the precise opposite, although there are different descriptions of it by different philosophers. Some have a more hopeful outlook of it, the more engaged and enthusiastic outlook of it, and others have a more tragic feeling about this indetermination. In any case, it seems to me to be a very important aspect, and of course, this is in the case. I'm assuming that the questions will have this deep impact or are having this deep impact, which is not always the case. And here, I think it's very useful also the distinction between discourse and exercises or practices that Ado uses, in the sense that we can conceive of the domain of discourse as a domain in which the domain of philosophical discourse as a domain where questions have a very important role. So in a less dogmatic sense, and we can do that when approaching different authors throughout the history of philosophy, trying to make philosophy as a way of life according to this model. And we can also conceive of this practical aspect of philosophy as a practice that involves as practices that involve questions, different practices of questions, and also as exercises that, and also as including exercises that might foster questions or questioning ability. So I think that by emphasizing questions, we have also some transformation of how both the domain of discourse and the domain of practices is often understood in discussions of philosophy as a way of life, and then in the consideration of particular authors. So I don't know.
1 minute.
1 minute. Let me see if there's something that should not be absent from the presentation. So there's a section where I discuss what specific effects, or discuss more in detail what specific effects these would have in a mapping of philosophy as a way of life. I also try to systematize different roles played by questions in different authors throughout history. So this will be the written version of the paper. And in the conclusion, I emphasize these crossroads between dogmas or wisdom in one hand and questions on another hand. And I also discussed the possibility of somehow conciliating it, or seeing philosophy as a continuum where sometimes the aspect of wisdom is more emphasized, at other moments the aspect of questions are more emphasized, but both could be included in a model of philosophy as a way of life. Perhaps the dialogue between the components would be especially fertile. I think that it would have great advantages to use this model in trying to distinguish philosophy from religion or other forms of activity where this component of questioning and the disturbing effect of questions is not as present, and perhaps also in the dialogue with other cultures this could be seen as a difference or as a common point also. I would be very interested to see what you think about it. And The disadvantages, it seemed to me that they are, or one of the main disadvantages is that it presents the usefulness of philosophy as something more questionable. If it has this very disturbing effect, it is not as easy to sell as if it has a tranquilizing and liberating effect. But I think that this can also be seen as an advantage. Simply, we have to change the way we understand what the usefulness of philosophy should be. Since I don't have time, I'll just mention it.
Thank you very much for your talk. We already have first question, Leonard. Yeah, a lot of questions. Take your hands up. Leonard first.
So, this is more really of a suggestion than a question. It could be that philosophy is a way of life, both involve a kind of knowledge and a kind of question. But this is more of a comment than a question. It could be that both of these activities, the acquisition of a certain kind of knowledge and the activity of questioning, are both essential parts of philosophy's way of life, but that they each play an instrumental role, and where wisdom, either as a regulative ideal or as an actual achievement, is the goal. So that it's not as though if you know enough, then you get wisdom, or if you ask enough questions, then you get wisdom. Although certain kinds of questions, for example, Zen koans, for example, are a particular kind of question because they stop reason. They crack the cosmic egg. Or Christ's miracles or parables, and also like koans in this way. You have to engage in them in a certain way, and then something breaks. So what I'm thinking is that wisdom, I mean, this is my opinion on this. Wisdom is as real as cream cheese. It's an organization of the organism. And Aristotle describes it very, very well. It's described very well in Confucian and Taoist texts. I mean, Confucius says, you know, when I was 60, 50, I set my mind to this. But at 70, I act on whim, but I don't cross the line. And I think this is very much like Aristotle's person who's achieved eudaimonia. It's like life becomes kind of effortless. Now the person becomes a sage. And in this sense, there's knowledge, but the knowledge is what the sage says. But the sage has it, but if you say it, it's not knowledge.
Yeah,
that's the comment.
Thank you very much. I would like to reply. One difficulty with conciliating wisdom and questions is that, at least in some philosophers, there seems to be a predominance of one of them. So there are philosophers that seem to be purely interrogative, where there seems, especially all the more skeptic versions, either the ones that are dogmatically skeptical, that say that we can never know, and those that say that we don't know anything at this moment. And here it seems to be more difficult to include the notion of knowledge. And also in some moments, when you, for instance, philosophers present a kind of absolute science, absolute knowledge, it seems that the interrogative moment becomes absent, is overcome, and we would still include this as philosophy. One important aspect that I did not have a chance to discuss is the fact that something that is very characteristic of Platonic philosophy or Platonic dialogues, and that I would also include as an important trait of philosophy as a way of life in the normative sense, or what would be the ideal form of philosophy, would be this idea that something may appear as wisdom and not be wisdom. So there may be claims to wisdom. And I even think about this passage of Lessing, that he says that if God would come and say, present me in one hand the eternal search for wisdom, and the other hand wisdom, I would choose the eternal search for wisdom. And this can be easily understood if we see that what normally happens is that one thinks that something that is not wisdom is wisdom. And in this sense, it would be, so say, a betrayal of the pursuit of wisdom as such, at least in this Platonic context. And this is what I think is very important. And if you look at the history of philosophy as a whole, which I think is the best way of looking at it, so not just looking at it as our favorite author or 2 or 3 favorite authors, but seeing the dialogue between them, what we see is that even though one may be convinced of having wisdom and absolute knowledge, the other one refutes, presents aspects that were not considered, present weak points of the theory. So it becomes, as a whole, something very interrogative, in the sense that they all put themselves in question. And I think this is more philosophical, so to say. And this is also why I think it should be as much emphasized as possible in all the authors considered as moments of this history, in the sense of emphasizing this philosophical moment of searching for wisdom, looking for wisdom, pursuing wisdom.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Please keep the question and answer short.
Will do. So just very quickly, then I'll add, I wonder if there's a third. I like this idea of your expansion to the whole history of philosophy. And in a way, I think it echoes Pavel's points that we not only need to go around the globe, but across our histories too. Real quick towards that end, I wonder if there's how you think about method in relation to the question and dogma. The reason I bring it up is a colleague who's not here, Simone de Agostino, brings up a really important point for the moderns, which is part of the reason they're interested in method is for its transformative role. Just the concern that our dogmatic attitude means we're not open to new lessons about the world. The problem is an old philosophical one. How do we organize the question? It goes back to Aristotle, right? That at least the claim is he didn't like the Platonic school's dialectics because they didn't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They were also dogmatic in essence. And I'll just end, I think it's a really important question in pragmatism. They're obsessed with that. The problem is not the way of life part, but way of life with no way to organize our inquiries. The last thing I'll say, maybe my provocative question is, can the question itself become dogmatic, depending on how you organize the inquiry of your questions? And Kant, the antinomies, bring this up too. There's dangers in the question too. So just thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. This would require a very long reply, but I'll try to be very, very brief. So one aspect I thought about is the fact that methodos in Greek means actually pursuit. So it's language used, for instance, in hunt. So that it has a dynamic element of inquiry precisely, and then it starts being used as this sequence of steps that one must follow to attain truth. In any case, in the sketches I made of the history of philosophy as inquiring or questioning way of life, there are very many elements where the questions or doubts play a methodic role in order to have access to the truth. So one has to go through doubt, and this is the methodic doubts of Descartes, for instance. So I associated with it, but I'll still have to think if there are other aspects that I'm not considering. And regarding the question becoming dogmatic, there is one way in which that can be limited if you consider that questions themselves can assume different forms, and we also have to learn how to ask the question. So Heidegger, for instance, emphasized at the beginning of being in time that we forget the question of being, and we are not even able to ask it, so that we need to train ourselves, and perhaps more in an intellectual sense in this case, but have to train ourselves to learn how to ask the question so that we can start discussing it and then eventually come to a reply. So we have also to learn questions, learn different ways of questioning, and so it must be something very flexible and not very static. But I think there's still a deeper level of your question that I'm not addressing in saying this. If we are simply assuming that there must be questions and we would refuse anything that would appear as knowledge or wisdom because we are decided beforehand that it must be an inquisitive attitude.
We'll have a longer discussion. Pragmatism has some interesting ideas. But
yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. That was really interesting, and I think you're raising a really important question. So I've got two comments. So first one, while you were talking, I was reminded of Sextus Empiricus and the distinction he draws between the dogmatists and the skeptics, the inquirers, the people who continue to ask questions. Now, if I remember rightly, Sextus is happy to call both of those groups philosophers, right? They're all philosophers. Obviously, he thinks the dogmatists have got it wrong, but they're philosophers nevertheless, right? So we've got those two different groups. Now, I think that in both of those cases, we want to say that the philosophical journey starts with questioning, right? You're no longer happy with the existing set of beliefs you've been brought up with. You're no longer happy with the values that you find yourself, your culture. So you start with questioning either way, right? And either you reach some answers, or you say, I think those guys have got the answers. I'm convinced by the arguments they offer. You then kind of become a dogmatist, right? And then you try and put those principles into action. Or you don't find any convincing answers, you just keep asking questions, and then you remain a skeptic. But I think in both cases, even in the case of the dogmatists, you're starting off with that questioning that you're quite rightly stressing is really important, right? So yeah, that's the first comment. So the second comment, so you mentioned my book, the Art of Living. And I think you're absolutely right, the way you characterize it. It's, you've got a set of dogma and then you want to put them into practice. And one of my motivations for putting it in those terms was very much the images we get in the Roman Stoics, like Seneca and Epictetus, where they stress the image of digestion, right? So you've got these ideas, now what are you going to do with them? You need to digest them and incorporate them into yourself. So, I mean, so my quick sort of, if you like, word of defense on that was very much an attempt to characterize what was going on in Roman Stoicism rather than a kind of a framework for thinking about all of philosophy, right? But actually, the Stoics are a really interesting case because in the very early period of the history, when you've got Zeno and Aristo and Cleanthes, you've got live philosophical argument, people are coming up with different ideas, there's real questioning in philosophical inquiry. Then Chrysippus comes along, and then everyone kind of rallies behind Chrysippus. He becomes the dogmatic thinker that then is the authority figure, right? And then in the so-called Middle Stoic period, you've got all sorts of people rejecting what we now think of as key Stoic doctrines. So there's obviously a huge amount of live philosophical debate going on still. And then a bit later, in the Roman period, it looks as if Posidonius started to become a kind of authority figure for people like Seneca and Cleanthes, alongside Chrysippus, right? So you see this real oscillation back and forth within the history of the 500 years of Stoicism, between periods where it looks like there's real live philosophical questioning, and there are periods when it becomes a bit more sort of ossified and certain people are pulled out as figures of authority, right? And I wonder if we might also use that as a way of thinking about other philosophical traditions too. So you might think about Platonism in those terms, right? And Aristotelianism, right? There are periods where they're all arguing amongst one another, and then there are periods where you get a kind of dogmatic figure. So I wonder if the kind of the dogmatism versus the continual questioning might be sort of poles that we find within different philosophical traditions.
Yeah, thank you very much. These questions are great, and they connect very closely with the aspects that were included in my attempt of sketching history of philosophy as a questioning way of life. So first is this distinction that Sextus makes in the beginning of the I don't know how the English translation of the word is, the Pyrrhonic hypothesis, outlines of Pyrrhonism. Exactly, the outlines of Pyrrhonism. So between the academic philosophers who say that we cannot find the truth, they questioned it out and they established dogmatically that we cannot know, and that they deal with probabilities only. And the Pyrrhonic skepticism that argues that we must still inquire and look for the truth, especially because of the therapeutic effect it has. But they don't doesn't formulate it like that in that particular section. This, I think, it also gives a good contrast between two different ways of questioning that we find throughout history of philosophy. Some more dogmatic about the impossibility of knowing, others seeing it more as a provisional state. So I see it as a very large division in the whole of history, and not just in the particular forms of ancient skepticism, the Quranic and the academic. And regarding Stoicism, this was also part of what you said was also what I tried to do in showing that even these very dogmatic schools that are presented in a very dogmatic fashion can be read as very dynamic, as having an inner dialogue. This is one of the attempts that I try to make, is to present things that are easily seen as dogmatic or forms of wisdom as being also philosophical in a very interrogative sense. But I hadn't thought about it regarding Platonism and Aristotelianism, and it is actually very useful for the whole medieval period. If we try to simply, instead of seeing the different thinkers as being representatives of a movement that is intrinsically dogmatic and solve the problems, try to see them as a very fertile dialogue within those assumptions that question often even some of the main assumptions of that thought. So that's very helpful to project what we see in Stoicism to all these movements.
Very last question.
All right, I'll make it quick. It's really about clarifying questions to see if I understood you correctly. So one of the main differences, if I understood you correctly, between what you call the sapiential model and the inquisitive model on the other side, seems to be that sapiential model implies a notion of philosophy as wisdom, while the inquisitive model implies a notion of philosophy as a quest of wisdom, precisely because philosophy is not wisdom. Is that correct? That's correct. So yeah, I'm wondering whether this is really a strong contraposition. Isn't that between philosophy intended as love or quest for wisdom and philosophy intended as wisdom one of the constitutive ambiguities of the ancient notion of philosophy, at least in Socrates, who was in fact told to be, was said to be wise precisely because he recognized that unfillable gap between himself and the transcendent norm of wisdom. I read it a bit differently in the Apology. So he's he doesn't have Sophia in the absolute sense. He has human Sophia, propine Sophia, and the adjective anthropine and the noun anthropos normally is a very pejorative sense in antiquity and in archaic Greece. So it's a form of offense. To call someone a human being is a way of showing the utmost despise for that person. It's very different from our conception of human being as associated with dignity. So he's saying that this is a very defective form of wisdom. It was the best we could come up with. And in this sense, he's trying to present as being already a very positive existential modality, so to speak, to be in this state of pursuit, that it already shows some superiority to the mere claims of wisdom that characterize everybody else. But it is not presented, I think, as wisdom. So I would be much more radical than I do is in my passages, where it seems to admit some wisdom to Socrates, or often in PWL literature, there's this admission that Socrates has some sort of wisdom. Cooper says that he has knowledge, he does not have wisdom. So often there's this terminological distinction between two different cognitive terms. I would be more radical about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is up. We will have coffee break. We will meet again at 12. And thanks a lot. Help me to